Nice. You too.
Very old friends here. Poets and otherwise. I'm going to, I have to read from this, I love this book, but also it came out recently, and I promised my publisher that I would go on reading from it. So I'm going to start with Anapatola Crosses a Bridge, which is the third, sorry. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for having me. It's so wonderful for you all to come out on such a beautiful day. I'm really thrilled to be reading for you today. So this is the third in a series on the city country Ravaka. And I don't know, I feel eager to just start reading, but I will tell you, Ravaka, across the three books, has been undergoing a crisis. And in this particular book, the narrator, so the book on the outside is called Anapatola Crosses a Bridge, but on the inside, it's her book, and it's called Enclosures. And I think of it as a kind of index, and she's sort of, she's writing a lot about writing and architecture and surviving this crisis with this idea that if she keeps writing about it, she will end it somehow. And if she writes about it as if it's over, it will somehow end. I think of each of these enclosures as bridges and maybe just to sort of get through them without knowing very much about what's going on in the book. Each of them is just a kind of trying in various ways. It could be sort of trying at the level of language, or trying for an emotional state, or just to see something, or just to make something still. And that's pretty much what she's doing throughout the book. And I'll just start. I began writing on my knees with my upper body bent over such that my head touched the floor space, a palm's distance from my knees. My knees spread with my ankles touching, my ass resting on the backs of my legs, my face relaxed, my breath shallow. Blank pages lay in an open circle in front of my bending posture. I imagined myself in a forest. I wanted to begin the book about architecture. I began the book about architecture in the fetal position with the word enclosure caught in my breath. I extended my arm and wrote, "Walls create an enclosure in which dreaming separates itself from sleep." And that would be the first sentence of the book for many days as I sat over it waiting for my question to change. The new question would make it impossible for me to order my sentences this way. I had to write through a rainstorm. I didn't leave the house. The winds were too strong. My neighbor's roof had fallen in. We all gathered at our windows to help. The rain seemed to go on for days as my word moved from enclosure to valve to hinge to something Latin that I could only say in my brain. It was an unassimilable word that nevertheless seemed to push me in a direction I had no intention of going. Walls created an enclosure in which dreaming separated itself from sleep, and the body stood up and walked into the city, but as an enclosed space that was walking to the wall and drawing a shape that invoked a figure bending forward with an arm thrust out, as if an offering, as if to make room for something facing, something turned and waiting to be welcomed, perhaps someone wanting to descend into the dense, narrow streets with you. The body draped over to draw another body as it ventured from shop to shop, looking for books and tools and candles, the hand shading, the hand making spirals, the body on the wall reaching back, wanting something. I didn't draw its head. I stopped at the shoulders. I didn't go below the shins. I read the wall with my dictionary, the Book of Gestures by Solusi. I drew a hand that was missing something, then drew a line from that hand, a thin, fragile line that came forward, bent, turned, broke, resumed its progression, but now below the previous line that moved toward a letter, that leaned into language, that reminded me of its body, than my body, was something like a map or just a message that said move, or just a failure of the third dimension, when you found out there weren't walls when you woke up. There was an intervening at the beginning of the despair that allowed some of us to go on in the vein of waiting and surviving and walking the gutter of the suddenly dry canal while not actually doing those things, just writing about them. In the intervening, we wore long scarves around our necks and held our notebooks close. Someone wrote the time in between on the wall and laughed at himself. I pulled my scarf tighter, also looped it through my jeans, and on occasion would tie myself to a telephone pole and stood there until something fell from the sky. Housen would walk by with his suitcase. Lucidity would bring me lunch. Lucidity wrote greatly on the wall inside her garden, and on the days I was rigged to the pole, she brought me lunch. There were still greens you could eat, thick and veiny, and grains cooked in clarified butter. There was tea, which you ate like food. The intervening mystified my writing practice. I lost count of my books. The stack fell over in my sleep and I crashed to the floor. Many nights in a row, the books did not hold me, but all the while there was this sense that we were not yet feeling what we felt. It gave you a preview, a time to outline, a time to make a line down your wall. Time passes. Everybody knew it. Everybody wrote those words. Everybody grew addicted to caffeine and wanted Valium. Everybody knew it. Time would pass through this. Zayoder pulled back and looked into my face. Time was all over him. It was invisible, but also heavy and grave. It was his language, the words he spoke, and it was my hearing his language and my words, which differed somewhat from his. Everybody knew it, I thought, in unison, I thought in unison with his looking. Rob, it killed me. I couldn't use it anymore. He closed his eyes. But I had nothing else. We've all written this, I said about the book I was writing to the group that was also writing, but each of us individually with our arms thrown out over our pages. I leaned over the book in front of me. Robert killed me when I wanted to speak about time. It had no discourse. It could not think time as it was also thinking produce sense or make space or whatever it was it thought as we bent our bodies over tables. But time passed through us nevertheless and wasn't beyond description, but couldn't be clocked and couldn't be avoided. He opened his eyes, he removed a handkerchief from his pocket and blew his nose. The sound carried across the cafe. People turned from their conversations, the elders clapped, then time passed through it, and we grew silent. Everybody knew it. I was able to stretch and say, everybody wrote it. I held my breath often. I did not breathe. My throat resisted the air. I moved down the street, failing. I could not breathe. My body wanted to be rid of me. I didn't have words for the buildings and their turned-in windows, folded into their evacuated state. I had lost architecture. I couldn't remember the parts of a building, so I held my breath. And what was the name of that thing? Too much time had passed. I had forgotten everything. Where was my body in this walk I did, where I moved for hours between neighborhoods and tried to read the city as it rearranged itself? I turned around. It changed. I held my breath. It wasn't funny. I couldn't think of one funny thing to say about it. The one does not exactly breathe when one laughs, so I went on trying to be funny. You wanted the not breathing to say something about the buildings that breathing failed to say. Zayoder and I sat at a table with our breath in our hands, while Luswaj and Bello urged us to return to breathing. I wanted someone to laugh. On most days, that was all I wanted. Luswaj called at night and mimicked laughter through her not breathing, but her sound had no joy in it. I imagined her cramped and alone and asked her to stop her performance and sat with her as she returned to form. I wrote a book about a group of friends surviving a crisis. Then the book became my life. I named it once I realized this was happening. Once I saw that I was writing on the previous day the script of the subsequent day in terms of who I saw and what I thought as I moved through the city. Once I saw this, I named the book and made it so that the life I was writing was also the life I had lived. It wouldn't just go one way. It wouldn't just be that I was living what I had written. I had to live in order to write, and I had to meet my friends and receive their writing in order to write. And they needed to see me write in order to go on writing. And we all needed to sit in that cafe and wait out this crisis that was taking away all the other writers. And not just the writers, but also the bus drivers and those students and the people who rode the trains and the audiences for our readings. I named the book that had become my life after the events of my life so that there would be no distinction. There was no distinction in my living. There was no break between days. You went to sleep, your body rested, but nothing changed. You woke into the same circling terrain of the city, the same buildings wandering and knocking into each other and knocking houses down, but nothing falling and no plaster coming off, just waddling and knocking and stumping buildings, looking all the time normal, but being absolutely unconventional in form. To think of architecture is to do what, Anna Petova, she asked me when the reports came out that our population had been decimated by 3 years of bewilderment and the feeling that one had been ghosted. The total number of inhabitants now only an eighth of what it had been. Why have we remained, you wondered when you sat emptily. The crisis made you watch it, and so did architecture, which you did until it devastated you. Then beyond that point, you still looking at it. My thinking of architecture resulted from my thinking of the line, how the line made narrative regardless of whatever else it was making. And narrative presented enclosures for your questions about living. And living, for the most part, requires space, which turned out to be a definite field of study. But in order to enjoy architecture, I realized I needed people, so I didn't know what to do, and they began to flee. I wrote a book in which I explained all of this. It was 183 pages and said, crisis, crisis in every chapter, and used drawings to illustrate the empty feeling, which I believe to be the case for everyone's leaving. Not everyone could move about a city as if they were traversing a remote highland, as if she were the last pedestrian in the world. Not everyone could say farewell all the time with her exhausted body clamoring over some pole. So I thought I would finish with some essays from a book I've been writing called Calamities. So these are essays that by nature of their title fail and are about nothing and really have no goals. So it's been really fun to write these. But it also turns out that these end up being about writing a lot too. And this one is actually about this book that I just read to you. So this is from Calamities. I'm going to read a few of these. Some of them try to be essays, and some of them are more like ditties, and you'll see the difference. They all begin with the same 4 words. I began the day wanting the language to describe a kind of writing that one could do that was not a physical act of producing marks on a page or computer screen, but was a duration of thinking in which the thing one had recently completed, in my case, Anna Petova crosses a bridge, which moved through my life so fast, so crisply, that I couldn't find in my body any feeling of having written it. I found the memory was no problem, but nothing in my muscles or in my breath that could tell me something of what it was like to have written that book. I wanted a duration in which the book I had written, which was the third in a series of books, and was a book in which fatigue made me break the line. It was a novel, but one tired of the form. I thought perhaps the reason I struggled to remember in my body this book that flashed through me was because immediately upon finishing it, I went straight into drawing. Though it was drawing that was rather like writing, and maybe there in the drawings was the record of this book I had made. I made the drawings because I wanted to evince a thinking space, one that could be seen and was not just a story we imagined about how thinking went on in our heads. Now I would be able to point to an aggregation of marks and say, I didn't think that I wanted to say anything about these drawings, and again sat down to try to document in language what it was like to write this book that entered me in January 2012 and exited me fully in April 2013. Language needed to be pre-informed somehow that I would need this testimony from it. So I thought I'd write an essay, let some time go by, and then try to contain the feeling again. I must have had a feeling of having written that book because it had become one of my favorite books to write, and I had written it listening to someone listen to me as I shaped this book on architecture, which was also and foremost a third installing of something that was both a country and an atlas of thinking at once. I hesitated because to pre-inform language genuinely, I thought I needed to go back in time to that day in January. That was the day before the book entered me, and say to my body that what was about to happen would be important. Not only because a manuscript would emerge from me cellularly and would go out into the world as the third trying of something mysterious and essential to my living, but also because the way that I would have to think in order to write the book would change me from that point forward. And later I would want to look back on the stages of that transformation and see the inscription of this new thinking. As I had done before, I would want the way the book changed me to be a book in itself, or at least an essay that could draw a clear picture of the story of my changing. But it was the same problem as before, where memory dulled the live experience of the body. It shadowed and presumed and thought all one needed was a picture of something, a sense of the fact of it, and didn't need nerve endings continuing to fire off and make sweat and cause palpitations in the thinker. And language more and more seemed to function like memory, and instead that took away your for. I began the day in a fog that cleared before I got the chance to write about it. I was in one neighborhood moving toward another thinking this fog, but slowly such that it took me a while to realize I wanted to say more than this fog about it. I wanted to document it, talk about the glare it produced and what it did to my perception of the buildings of the city I was visiting. Eventually, I thought this is an essay, then looked up to take it all in. I was surprised to see that the sky had cleared. It was a stunning blue, and I had lost my memory entirely. That is not exactly true, as I remembered in vivid detail that I had just made a decision to look at the world, i.e. the sky, in such a way as to produce an essay. But looking out at the world, I couldn't figure out what was so special to say right then. It was a beautiful day in this place. I entered a density of streets that formed a plain, or maybe had a plain underneath. People were dressed oddly. High-waist pants, glasses with excessively large and hexagonal lenses, blouses and button-down shirts adorned in glitter and checks, patterned stockings with rips in them. Mostly it was that everyone's hair was overgrown and flat or huge and beckoning. People looked frizzy. yet seemed to feel delectable. In any case, there was a feeling of elevation, like we were all riding glass-encased, rising, falling structures. I began the day looking at nothing move slowly in and out of focus on a movie screen. I stared at the expanse of it. I thought it was the night. I thought I saw telephone wires in the night. I thought I saw the bottom corner of the night curl up like a page, the screen becoming a kind of absolute for 10 silent minutes, until the darkest part of the night became the top of the hill that took up the entire width of the lower part of the screen. And the lighter part of what had been nothing suddenly filled with explosive shocks of light. Then it all went black again. Clearly this new black was the nothing that I had mistaken the earlier black for. A person got up and went to the bathroom. I was writing in near complete darkness about this when suddenly everything was repaired. There was an image of the sea, though this surprised me. It seemed integral to this very slow-moving film. The sea moves, but not in the direction of most things. I felt sure that most things moved from left to right or in the reverse, but the sea had an entirely other relationship to space. It seemed to move backward, pushing at the end of it. The sea wanted to reach the end of space, then to rush back here, then to push out, then to return again. It had been a long time of watching figures move across the screen on some type of boardwalk, moving in two streams in opposing directions, the light of their commute dull, pink, and very dark. I began the day reading the third section of Eileen Miles's Inferno. I was in heaven and had only been awake a short time and was reading still in the bed on my side. I hadn't yet had coffee, so after a line or so of the book, my eyes would close. I would be sleeping, except also reading. The book would continue in my mind as I slept, how much time passes in this state. Then I'd wake all of a sudden, and the book would have fallen onto the floor. It wasn't a high bed, or would be sitting at an impossible angle in my hand. I would write the book and try to find my place. The lines I'd been reading would not be there. Where had I gotten them? They continued the story perfectly, but not, it turned out, in the direction Eileen wanted it to go. Why not? My additions were not terrible, and they seemed bodily connected to her text. And what's further, they stayed with me as I went on reading, mingling with the lines that actually were there. I woke up again. I was thinking this and not reading the page I was reading, and didn't quite know that I was thinking, though it made sense with what had been on my mind before I fell asleep. I'd been talking about how your mind writes what you read and lays it out only 1 or 2 steps ahead of you, so that there's always a risk of taking a step that isn't yet there. I began the day awake from having not yet slept, such that it was hard to think of it as a beginning, since in this case there had been no break. Nevertheless, I began wondering if something had been said in a particularly lucid moment was still true now that I had moved on from that moment. With time and my being less lucid, which I would have to be having not yet slept, make something past, thus certainly over, less lucid than it had been at the time, its actual time in occurring. Does no longer being in the past but thinking on it do a violence to it, that thing that is now over? When I had awoken, I could barely open my eyes, yet because I wasn't really waking, my eyes were already open. But to see the screen on the computer, it was as if they had been closed. I sat and wrote through squints and tried to remember what it was that I said. That right before that moment I'd recall as exceptionally brilliant, though at the time I had only thought lucid. On top of remembering, I was now marveling at how something goes from lucid to brilliant in the matter of minutes, particularly when it's something that oneself has said. I felt that I was in a closet right then, and that this must have been what people meant when they said the word hermit. And I'm going to close. I was asked to participate in an anthology on women in clothes, which is not something that I would normally go anywhere near. But I thought, of course, you could write a calamity about women in clothes because they're a calamitous situation for me. So, and then I wrote it, and it turned out to be a kind of love poem. So this is it. And it has this thing where one of the women in clothes is a quote, which is, I guess it's a so-called woman in clothes, but then there's a woman in clothes that's italics, which is sort of like a story, like an as-if a woman in clothes. And then there's a woman in clothes without any adornment, and that's a successful woman in clothes. So you'll have to see which one is which. I mean, I can do this, but I don't know how to do the towel. I began the day a woman in clothes, wanting to be a woman in clothes because Danielle had had a certain body all her life. And I had had a certain body, but where she had regained the body of her life, which she had temporarily lost, such that she carried a memory of the other body but didn't have to see it. I had this body, which had been mine for a long time, but which may not have been my body, in that sense of Danielle's, a body she liked to drape in clothes. My body was wearing red pajamas, and hers the dark green, and hers made a shape around her butt, with the line bisecting and the line wrote ass all over everything. My line wrote penis pocket because of the slit, the pouch at the front of the red pajamas. And the day was getting on. I was wondering how to be a woman in my red pajamas and thick red wool sweater, my skin-tight pajamas, my striped sweater. I was wondering how, if the bell rang, I could run down the stairs, a woman in clothes, as if someone had written a story about our day, where we stayed on this side of the snow that was falling, and the inside was our city. We wanted a city full of living, so we walked quickly back and forth in front of the full-length mirror. She swished past me, I swished past her, with hours passing. We were women in clothes for a time, despite my undershirt being tucked into my skin tights. And this made you want to get to know a person. You are red everything, she said, looking all the way to my socks. But my slit, my pocket made me shy, and I was dizzy from the speed of my walking. I was in my skin-tight pajamas and carried in them a voluptuous body which was probably an imposter. My sweater sat on top of my belly, my socks slid across the floor. I was red, black, red, red, black, in that order, and something else in reverse. Then several hours passed. She was now in a white shirt, wrote the story, a blouse intersected by blue infinitely, and though the woman was dressed, it carried on. And though Danielle was now in bed, I began writing my own story. She was wearing jeans, and this was her body. To find mine, I had to push my hand through the slit, the pouch of the red pajamas, and show the ring on my little finger. It was something along the road to getting there. It was a feminine gesture, if you looked only at the grace of the hand and accessory.